Well, anyway, welcome. It's been a couple of weeks since we last met, and like some of you, possibly, I've just gotten off watching The X-Files in its new brand spanking new form. And, well, all I have to say is that some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is something far scarier than any of the X-File writers could ever imagine. There is good news to it, but there are elements of what we're about to talk about that can be somewhat disturbing, and it's not just about secret governments and UFOs and that kind of thing. It has much more to do with our own inner nature. Well, let's start with this little question, which is up on the screen. It's a question that's commonly asked. There are many books written about it. The technical term for it in the theological world is theodicy, which is kind of the justice of God, roughly. And the question is, if God is all good, why is there evil? And most Western religions, let's see, there it is. Here's a common conclusion that people reach. Either God is not all good, which case for some reason best known to himself, he created evil, or God is not all powerful. That is, evil wasn't really his idea and he can't really stop it. And you will see lots of discussions that are thoughtful at the same time end up seeming somewhat absurd. I mean, if you want to blame God for human evil, well, it is humans that are actually doing this evil. If I go up and start slamming my head against the wall repeatedly, all the while yelling at you for what horrible people you are for not stopping me from slamming my own head against the wall, there's probably something wrong there. And one does sense that these concepts of theodicy are all a little problematic. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be said about it. But since we're doing this from the point of view of the Course, I'm going to focus on the Course's view, which is quite simple and quite self-consistent. God is both all good and all powerful. Therefore, evil is not real. And that's one of the central teachings of the Course. One thing I want to mention about the Course is that it is extremely logical. And this is one thing that's striking about it in terms of Christian theology, which often is completely illogical and has gotten into so many logical, theological, philosophical corners that it's often had to rescue itself by taking refuge in, well, it's all just sort of a mystery. Well, then why bother talking about it to begin with? But the Course is, as I say, remarkably in the world of Christian theology, it is very self-consistent once you grant its premises. All systems that have some kind of logical element to them start with certain principles that then work with each other towards certain conclusions. And the Course definitely has these, and we'll look into some of them. Here is what is written on the first page of the text. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And that is the Course's own summary of its own ideas. To understand where this is coming from, you do have to set aside common views of reality and the real. This is not easy to do, even because of the etymology of the word real. The word real comes from the Latin res, meaning thing. So what is real has a certain thingness to it. Like, for example, real estate. So we inevitably think of what is real as being somehow thing-like or involving a thing. You could go a huge way in discussing that and exploring the ramifications of it. I talk a little bit about it in my book, The Dice Game of Shiva, but I'm going to limit myself to the Course's view here because we're talking about the Course. So where did evil come from? Another concept that the Course emphasizes very much is that God created me and you like himself, again, using the masculine and Christian terms that the Course favors. Thus, I have the power to create. Now, the Course also speaks of the Father and the Son in much the way that Christian theology does. But its attitude toward these is very, very different. For one thing, the Son there's only one Son, and that is all of us. Just to keep it simple, the whole human race put together. Again, going back to something I mentioned, is Jesus the Christ? Yes, along with you. So there is the Father and there is the Son. The Son is identical to the Father in all respects, including in terms of power, creativity, love, will, infinity, and so on. There is only one difference, according to the Course, between the Father and the Son. The Father generated the Son. The Son did not generate the Father. That is pretty much it. As a result, you will have many passages in the Course that emphasize one's own powerlessness. I am limitless as a son of God, and all God's power is given to me, and so on. So we, collectively and individually, have tremendous power. And here's a further elaboration of that. Your will to create was given you by your Creator. Since creative ability rests in the mind, everything you create is a matter of will. Now, this issue of creative ability is extremely important and is key to a lot of what I'm going to be saying, because this capacity to create belongs to us equally as it does to the Father, because we all have the same powers that God has. So we can create. And there are, one of the things, of course, is not wildly specific about is the nature of these creations of ours, because it does use the word creations. Minimally, these creations can be seen as loving thoughts, but one also has the sense, and this is not really elaborated on terribly much in the Course, that these loving thoughts, in a sense, are can or might be beings like us. There is a teaching in the Jewish tradition known as the Kabbalah, which says that every good act, every pious act creates an angel. Now, there's nothing quite identical to this in the Course, but sometimes it does sound as if the Course is implying something of the kind. Creation is extension. That is another way of viewing it. The Father extended himself into the Son. Because he extended himself into the Son, he loves his creations. And that is another little feature about creation, which is you always love your creations as God loves us infinitely. Again, When you create from love. Therefore, you feel connected with what you create. In this way, you create as God creates. Some of you may be familiar with my book, Conscious Love, in which I talk about love, and I give a definition of love as that which unites self and other. That is to say, in this case, you've created something and you're united with it. In a way, you're still connected with it, even though there may be some kind of apparent distinction between you and it. You love what you create. You necessarily love what you create. Well, you also have the power to miscreate. This ties in a little bit with the traditional Christian view of free will. And I wouldn't take that capacity, that correlation too far, because there are a lot of differences between traditional Christian theology and what the Course is saying. But you do have the power to miscreate up to a point. And this is, in a way, what we're leading into. There is an inappropriate use of extension, and it's called projection. That is to say, you create something, or the Course in this context would use the term make. You make something, and that doesn't necessarily mean in a carpenter shop or with your hands, but you make an idea. But your feelings about it are somewhat conflicted. There must be some good in it, or it wouldn't exist at all. But there's something you don't like about it. There's something, and you project it, and you do not wish to see that you've made it, and that you're connected with it in that way. So what do? You project it, in this case, onto other people. Now you'll see both here and later on, the Course is using things that talk very much like psychological terms. Because remember, the people who transmitted the Course were psychologists. So they knew all of this stuff. They knew all about Freud and Jung and so on. So this terminology was familiar to them. And this is a term that comes out of psychology. You project, you see something in yourself, but you don't exactly necessarily want to see it in yourself. So you put it onto someone else. And this is called projection. Well, recognize this individual? If you had seen a picture of him 20 years ago, maybe you would have thought, oh yeah, I remember Fat Albert, and he's lovable Dr. Huxtable, and so on. Today, it's a bit, shall we say, more ambiguous. I did suggest that you read that web posting of mine on Should We Forgive Bill Cosby? I'll say a little more about that specifically in a couple of minutes, but Bill Cosby's accused of some terrible things. Did he do these things? Well, frankly, I don't know. But it's interesting to watch the responses to him. We'll just take this picture, this image, very, very simply. This is a picture of a man whom I am pretty sure is familiar to all of you. What exactly do you perceive? What do you cognize when you see this picture? And there are several layers of it. One is what you were really seeing in the naked physical sense is a bunch of dots on us, little tiny dots on the screen in color that are all kind of jumbled together. That is what your physical eyes are seeing. Now, you're not seeing that. In fact, it probably took a second or two for you to acknowledge that that is actually the truth of the situation, because your mind doesn't go there. The next thing your mind does is it organizes these collection of random, not random, but dots into a recognizable pattern. And this pattern is a familiar face of a celebrity. So you recognize it, you're able to identify it, you're able to give it a name, right? So that, up to a certain extent, is factual. The identification of the name is to a certain extent factual. Now, notice that very likely, well, certain things come up. Why don't you, why don't I turn it over to you? Perhaps we could get some reactions from some of you to this space, or for that matter, to the article I wrote. I'm not interested in what you think Bill Cosby did or didn't do. I'm interested in your kind of, say, first reaction to seeing an image like this. Favorable, unfavorable? A couple of people are typing. I'm pleased with myself at least being able to get a high-resolution image. I'm not always able to do that. Okay, my preference is an expression on his face. That's true. Disgusted. Okay. I feel sad. Okay, good. Face of someone who's defensive, holding guard, a man who appears empty. Believe he feels unhappy at this time. All very good. Good, fine. Well, let's look at this in line of what the Course may have to say about it. Well, you see this face, you recognize it. Now, this face is connected with a human being, whom in all likelihood you, like me, don't know personally. So there's the facts of who he is, and then there's a response: disgusted, sad, a man who feels empty, and so on. That is a judgment in the Course's view. It's a judgment. You'll notice that there's been an enormous amount in the last few decades where people of even extremely judgmental people attempt to, I'm not judging you. I don't want to be judgmental here. I really find it fascinating that the Course's attitude toward judgment, which has made its way into kind of the human potential New Age community, has spread so far, and it's diffused itself. Not always in a necessarily healthy way, but it has been actually extremely influential. If you asked a person in the year 1950 if judgment was bad in and of itself, the person would say, well, I don't know, it depends. A person today would be much more likely to say that judgment is bad. And that is to some extent a result of the Course's influence. The Course is saying that the extent to which you see this in someone else is the result of it being present in your own mind. You project what you dislike onto someone or something else. And, it's often a very, very touchy issue. I sometimes like to say, beware the sin you condemn, it will be the next sin you commit. But without wanting to get too political, you can see, any number of people who are anti-homosexual who end up kind of nudging guys in men's room stalls. Obviously, there's some kind of dissociation there. They see something in themselves, they don't like it, they want to blame or hurt other people for it. That's a fairly obvious use of that, and it's either comical or tragic depending on what kind of angle you want to look at it from. But you don't realize that you've made all this yourself. Now, what I'm talking about up to this point are some fairly ordinary and familiar examples. But the Course says that this whole projection and this doing something that you don't like and projecting it onto the world is much more fundamental and much more basic than we have any reason to believe. And this is in a sense where it gets scary, because suddenly, we've met the enemy and he is us. And this is an extremely important term in the Course. It appears all the time. And if you don't understand this word as used in the Course's sense, you're not really going to understand the Course. But you could say the part of the mind that engages in this kind of projection is called the ego. Now, again, it would be very, very good, at least for the purposes of this discussion, to set aside conventional notions of the ego. Even though the people who wrote down the Course were quite familiar with the way Jung and Freud and so on used it, the Course is not using it in that way at all. The Course is using it as the ego, as it is viewed in the Course, is like a fundamental shaper of reality. What is it doing? It perceives itself alone, frightened, afraid, isolated, and at one point it says, I see a meaningless world. A meaningless world engenders fear, and the ego is creation, or the, shall we say, the result of fear, or the producer of fear, looked at from another angle. The Course is very emphatic in saying there are only two emotions, basically, which are love and fear. If you are not feeling love, at some level, fear is operating. It doesn't take very long or very much reflection to realize that a lot of this is simply going on at an unconscious level. But this ego is this kind of mass of fears. What is the ego? Essentially, it's the belief that you can be apart from God. Now, if you want to back up a little bit, we were talking about creation. You can create anything. And you can even create things that are not true. Or rather, the Course always speaks of creation in a positive sense. When it's talking about the world of manifest appearances, it uses the term making. You may have already noticed this from some of the things I've quoted. Well, and this is, if not how it happened, it's close to how the Course describes how it happens. And, you'll notice this, let's see here, this tiny mad idea. And it is an absurd, mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. Or, as we would put it today, did not remember to laugh. And then you take the idea seriously, impossible both accomplishment and sincereness of it. This is how the world came to be according to the Course. I don't mean just the earth, I mean manifest existence as we know it. It is the result of this tiny mad idea known as the ego. And that's why I said, it starts to get scary. Well, it would all be very well and good if the enemy were, some secret government or, some bizarre conspiracy, that sort of thing. But it's a little more scary when this secret government, this bizarre conspiracy, is what you most closely and dearly identify with, and that is what the Course is saying. The Course also says it's a course in mind training, and it also says it's a reversal of the world's way of seeing things, because the world, as the Course uses it, is the creation of the ego. Everything you can think of out here is the world. It's the creation of the ego. Well, now things start to become a little clearer if you accept all this, because the ego created this kind of, shall we say, defective world, or made this defective world. In any case, made this defective world. Well, yeah, sure, there are going to be wars, there are plane crashes, there are going to be massacres and atrocities and that sort of thing. And the Course is very, very, very harsh in its description of the ego. Very harsh. I mean, the ego is a killer. The ego is a murderer. It is incapable of joining with anything except in a kind of very shaky, uneasy truce that's kind of an alliance. And even then, it has its mind completely set on betrayal. So the Course views views the ego completely negatively. And because the world is created or made, generated by the ego, that's why the world is. God did not create this world. God did not create a world of evil, a meaningless world. We entertained the possibility that there might be such a thing. Again, this is both an individual and a collective decision. We entertained the possibility of this, and we decided, hey, maybe it could be true. And what the Course calls the separation, what conventional Christianity calls the fall, is exactly the result of this. So the world you see, the world I see, is a creation of the ego. The ego made the world that the body's eyes see. Yeah, and in fact, I could cross out a lot of this. I could cross out this whole line. I could cross out half of this line. Because, according to the Course, the ego made the body. Well, if you are the Son of God, if you are perfect and infinite, what possible harm could come to you? If you want to believe in fear, if you want to believe that harm can come to you, you have to make some sort of object to which this kind of harm can come. And what better thing than the body? Because, as the Course points out, all your fears, all your preoccupations, all your problems have in one way to do with the fate of the body. Whether if you're talking about illness, whether getting enough to eat, whether the body has a comfortable place to sleep, whether this body is esteemed enough by other bodies so that it remains to a certain degree safe and apparently loved. If you had no body in the physical sense, all of your problems would be gone. That is the Course's teaching. Well, not exactly. Because, of course, since the body is the result of the ego, it's really the ego that's the problem. Now, the Course emphasizes both that the ego made the body. The body was kind of a place in which the deluded Son of God hides from God. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, according to Genesis, the first thing that happens is they become ashamed and they hide. Well, this is an aspect of that, since you're hiding in the body. You are, as William Butler Yeats said, fastened to a dying animal. Now, be very careful in not taking a further step here, because it's starting to sound very much like traditional Christianity, where the body is evil. And that, of course, says is mistaken. The body is completely neutral. It is purely a result. It does nothing of its own. It is just there. It does what you want to do, and it does what you believe it ought to do. So it's not evil. It's not wicked in and of itself. It's not good either. It's just neutral. My body is a completely neutral thing. And the uses you make of the body are very much the topic of the way back. One of the most striking lines in the Course, in the textbook, is, I will not use the body's eyes today. I always found that a little bit hard to wrap my head around, but seeing and true perception are very much a part of what the Course is talking about. And here you find, if you follow this and take it, I see a meaningless world. I am upset that I see a meaningless world. Many of you, no doubt, are on Facebook. And if your Facebook feed is anything like mine, it is a string of laments, complaints, protests about this apparently meaningless world. Why could this happen? What is going on? Why should this be the case? Why are the stupidest, craziest people getting the most attention? Well, why? Because this is the world that's created by the ego, or made by the ego. The world is insane in its ordinary form. But again, this is not the world that God created. God did not create a meaningless world. Goes on to say a meaningless world engenders fear. So the fear you have, that I have, is one that's created by seeing a world that doesn't really make any sense, being afraid of it, and recoiling. But it's also the result of our, in a sense, having tried to flee from God. The answer, well, it goes back to this. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. God didn't create any of this, right? This is all the makings of the ego. Now, this, I have to say that this starts to get very, very subtle, and it has a lot of ramifications. One thing that people don't realize very often is that cognition, that is just merely perceiving, apprehending, seeing the world, is not a passive process. It's an active process. You are filtering in all of this sense data, they used to be called, being fed into you and processing it. That's the conventional view. The Course's view is you have made a judgment about the world, that there can be a world in which you're separated from God, which you're cut off, and which you can suffer. There's a line in the Course that I found very striking when I first read it that says, perception follows judgment. The opposite in a way, the way it seemed with our good friend Bill Cosby a few minutes ago. We seem to think that perception comes first and then we have a judgment about it, and that does seem to be the case. But in the way the world is, we decided the world was fearful and made a world that suited these preconceptions. Now, the other thing is that this is not in any way like a conscious process. And it would have happened, this whole thing, what the Course calls a separation, would have taken place, shall we say, in times and realms we really can't imagine. So why do little babies suffer? Well, little babies are part of the whole thing. Did they consciously choose this? No, they didn't. But at a deeper metaphysical level, we all did. Did you come into the world completely clean and fresh? Well, that's the idea, but the truth may be a little bit more different, at least at very, very different, deep levels of your being and your consciousness, with which we frankly have very little contact and awareness most of the time. But anyway, this is, hey, remember this? Since this world is basically made up kind of almost atomistically of attack thoughts, the way to get out of it is to give up attack thoughts. Because the ego as I say, it's almost literally, it is literally made up of attack thoughts. It imagined it could be attacked. The Son of God imagined he could be attacked, and his imagination was powerful enough to make it seem very, 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 very real. And of course, if perception follows judgment, you can kind of pull a world into being that reflects this all too clearly. And probably, I would say, most people who are into spirituality have some sense of a world that's problematic, a world that in some way or another needs to be escaped from, not necessarily in terms of floating up to heaven, but there has to be something better than this out there. And I have to have some kind of connection with it. Maybe you envisage that as enlightenment. Maybe you envisage that as salvation, moksha, as the Hindus say, whatever you like. But nirvana, of course. But there's something problematic. Man is the animal that believes something is wrong. Why? Well, precisely because our ego, this thing we made up, exists to believe something is wrong. So what does giving up attack thoughts entail? Well, it's quite simple. So that is why the Course is sort of saying, and the Course emphasizes forgiveness enormously. These are just two examples. Forgiveness, well, forgiveness is not what we, and I have to distinguish the argument I made about forgiveness in that web piece, if you read it, from what the Course is saying. And I'm going to stick with what the Course is saying here. But if God didn't create this, well, in a sense, it didn't really happen. You just imagined it. We just imagined it. I just imagined it. So if it really didn't happen, nothing is really wrong. So let it all go. And this is, in a way, a very, very central part of the way the Course, presents its spiritual teaching. It's both the method and goal of it. And it says, perception in its ordinary sense is, in a sense, false perception. It does say, speak about something called true perception, in which you perceive a world that is forgiven, which there's nothing wrong or problematic. And it does talk about perceiving and cognition. It's not just like, going up to heaven or something like that. It's a way of seeing the world. So let's see, where are we getting to here? Have I come to the end of my thing? Evidently I have. Well, this is actually quite a lot, and as I say, there's an element of it that's quite scary, because what you think of as your best friend, or rather what you think of as you, is the source of all these problems. The problem, it finds problems. Ever notice problems are very funny, because, as I said, I think in a class or two ago, that everybody has this list of problems. The minute one is wiped off, the next one comes to the fore, and for some miraculous reason, you come to the end of the list, there'll be ones that start to add up. In a sense, the world is almost a collection of problems, and that's certainly the way we often experience it. So to let go of these problems, to let go of these attack thoughts, entails forgiveness as the Course sees it. As I say, it's a little different from the way the world sees it, because, in fact, the Course talks about forgiveness to attack. Here's a question. Is the ultimate to perceive without judgment, so forgiveness is not needed? Yes. In a sense, I can answer very simply, yeah, that's right, that is. Forgiveness is only a correction. Forgiveness is, and this whole process of correction, collectively, globally, cosmically, is what the Course calls the atonement, the opposite of separation, the separation. And forgiveness is, the one of the chief ways of doing this. And once you get beyond this level of forgiveness, once you perceive without judgment, you go into another level. And the Course does talk about this, but not very specifically, because it emphasizes how much that it's a matter of direct experience. It talks about you go from false perception, that is to say the mess we normally perceive the world to be, to true perception, kind of a blessed world that's seen through the eyes of forgiveness, to knowledge, which in a sense is kind of a direct contact with God. This knowledge, in a sense, is possible, in a sense, every minute, but to some extent there's also something of a process of correction that needs to take place first. Any other questions or thoughts? This is, I'm about at the end of my, prepared business, so we can open it up for discussion. I could see that it'd be, in a way it's quite difficult, because you're dealing with a system that's using terms in very, very different ways from our ordinary ones. And that's why, in a sense, it's useful to spell out some of these very, very basic things. If you really want to work with the Course, as I say earlier, it is best to start with a workbook where these things are, ideas are introduced experientially, in kind of little bits that, kind of digested by the day, rather than the whole theoretical basis. So you can see, again, that I've been thinking lately that perceiving in love is what allows miracles and leads to the atonement, at one. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. And of course, miracles would go on and say even more, perhaps radically, is that only loving thoughts are true. It goes further than that. It says that a thought is true only to the extent that it is loving. So this is quite a different take on reality, truth, than we normally give it. And it's a mind stretch. This is, as I say, of course, in mind training, and it is a reversal in the world's thinking. And one of the challenges of it personally, I've always found is to say, well, yeah, I'm working with these ideas, the ideas that I've just presented to you. But on the other hand, in a certain kind of realistic way, I have to, understand that not everybody else sees things that way, and I have to at least speak to them in a sense as if, at a different level. How can we find peace and happiness while perceiving all the evil in the world? Well, you can't. It's one or the other. Insofar as you perceive evil, you will not perceive peace and happiness. There's a great amount in the Course, about, again, projection. The ego is projecting its evil out into the world. Does this mean that you are doing all sorts of bad, you personally are doing all sorts of bad things in the Middle East and God knows where? No, it doesn't mean that. It's not talking at that level. But the fact that the ego set up a situation in which evil is possible, or harm is possible, is really the cause. Now, you have to be careful, and again, there's a question of two levels, and in a sense, well, did these events take place in a certain sort of way? Yeah, but of course, at a certain point, you're going to have to look past them. And is that copping out? Well, no, not really, because actually the whole solution for all of these is the atonement, and you're working toward the atonement by doing these things in your own way, at your own level. Is that the cause of depression? Yes. Yeah, that's if you feel cut off from God, every problem you have in the Courses, every last problem is that you feel erroneously that you were separated from God. I say you, and I could just as well say I. And it's a thing I have to remind myself on a day-to-day basis of, because this is it's a spiritual discipline. I think you probably know enough about the Course at this point to realize that anyone who lived up to its teachings perfectly would be a saint. There aren't too many saints around, so the rest of us are all just sort of working at it. But yes, that's very true. That is the cause of depression. It's how you heal that depression. Now, let's see. No, I don't feel cut. I'll go with Jeanette's question first because it's a follow-up there. No, I don't feel cut off from God, but I feel depression. Well, feeling cut off from God, we're talking about at a very, very deep experiential level. We're not really talking about theology, and the Course is working toward bringing you to this experiential level of not feeling cut off from God. If you didn't feel cut off from God, you wouldn't feel depression. At some level, you must or do, and I certainly have experienced depression, and I could say the same thing, or I'm not really going to cut off from God. It sounds all kind of theological. I just feel kind of awful. But of course, is saying that ultimately that is where it's coming from. How you remedy this is the matter of what, of course, would say is a very specialized curriculum. That is to say, this is one of the paths of, shall we say, universal healing. And the form it will take, even granting the Course, will vary a lot in people's lives. To go back to Julie's question, is the main idea here the saying, as you believe, so shall it be? Yeah, that's basically it. But you can immediately see the kind of problems that come up here. And you do see it a lot in the world of the positive thinking movement and so on. Because this level of belief where you're creating it or making it happen is very, very deep-seated. It's not just changing the thoughts in your head, or it may be initially, but it's going to have to go deeper than that. But I never doubt God. Yeah, well, it's everybody has their own little attitudes, and it's quite funny. I was writing an editorial today about Islam because the next issue of our magazine is on Islam, and a woman at Wheaton College nearby, which is a kind of a premier evangelical Christian institution, is under proceedings for termination for saying publicly that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Well, my response to that is, do any two people worship the same God? Cognitively. If God is your father, some people, if your father was a drunk, you may not want to think of, you mean drunk, your father, you may not want to think of God as your father. You may need to use another image. In any case, a Course is, although it is conceptual, there is also a level of experience. And a Course is much more focused, and that's why the workbook is so important, on bringing you to an inner level experience, which is a meditative experience. I mean, there are very specific directions that it gives in specific lessons. If you go through all the lessons, the meditative practice becomes more open-ended. And at that point, it's basically says, well, you have enough of a connection now with God and the Holy Spirit to do it for yourself. This is a course in miracles. If I take a course in driving, eventually I learn how to drive. I don't need to take the course anymore. Anything else? On the one hand, I want to ask you just kind of briefly, is what I've said reasonably clear? I mean, just in terms of content. And two, does it make sense to you? Very insightful, thank you. Oh, good, thank you. Yes, to both. It's been very illuminating for me. I mean, one thing I have to say about the Course is, I mean, sometimes I do find myself coming back to it and simply saying, I don't really see any other way out. And when I say way out, the, shall we say, limited and often appearing evil world that we see, I don't see any other way out of it than through this, or an approach like this. That's not to say other people and other traditions can't have other approaches, but this seems the best, at least for our time and our era. And I mean, I have to admit, this was given in our time and in our era. And it's important, I think, to recognize that, in a sense, it's called the perennial tradition. It's Well, of course, we put it the way in which the idea that God is not insane makes most sense to you. Because if God made all of this, God would be insane. As everybody kind of says, well, Jesus, the way the world is, God made this, you just as well to stay away from any God who made something like this. Of course, it's saying, of course, exactly. You made this world, I made this world as a way of hiding from God. And, it started as kind of a funny joke, but we kind of didn't exactly recognize where the exit is. And we're kind of groping around in the dark trying to find the exit. I would say this is a lot. This is a reversal of pretty much everything anyone has ever been taught, including me. So rather than just a tip for dealing with these ideas, rather than either necessarily grabbing onto them or rejecting them in any kind of automatic way, it's often best to kind of just sit with them. To use a line that I may have used earlier, sometimes neither accept nor reject is a good way of dealing with ideas of this kind, particularly ones that are so radically different from those of conventional thinking. And that's why one reason there are course groups, course communities, and that sort of thing, because I remember when I started doing this myself, and this was back in 1981, I just started, I bought the things as a curiosity, as I probably told you, and I did it so this is getting kind of interesting, kind of powerful, but it's not going to make any sense to anybody I know. So I really felt the need to find a group, and I did. I was in San Francisco at the time, so there were at least one major Course in Miracles group. But so it is helpful when people meet and to reinforce these things. There's a whole different question of to what extent you want to go around preaching them. And this requires great subtlety and great discrimination, as the Course itself says. Who's ready for just a little, who's ready for more? If you go around saying, this is all unreal, God did not create this. Well, for some reason we got cut off for no reason that I understand. But that probably means it's time to say sayonara for this evening, because it is 9 o'clock. And, as I said, I do like to be reasonably precise with beginnings and endings, if only as a courtesy to all of you. So why don't we take this next week to think a little bit about healing? I was just about to talk a bit about it, but maybe you could think a little bit about healing. What exactly is healing in your mind? What helps healing and what doesn't? So with that reflection, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you have a wonderful week, and thank you for your very kind interest